You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City. I'm editor at large at The Diplomat and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm delighted today to be joined by Abhigan Reg, the Diplomat's security and defense editor. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking, Ankit.
Yeah, it's terrific to have you back. Today I'm hoping to spend some time with you, Abhi, just digging into the U.S.-India relationship. And this is something that, we come back to on the podcast a fair bit. It's a prominent relationship, one that continues to be on an upward trajectory. But really, that is what I want to zero in on today is the trajectory. And some of our listeners, especially those who I guess have the misfortune to spend as much of their time on Twitter as I do, may have recently caught wind of a little bit of a debate, a discourse, let's say, going on around the U.S.-India watcher scene. I don't even know if you can really call it a scene, but our friends and colleagues have been talking about the notion of illiberalism in India and the implications that may have on India's foreign relations, and specifically its relationship with the United States. Of course, I say illiberalism in India, taking that as a premise, but of course there are many who dispute that to begin with. But I think it is, fair to say that recent developments, really going back to a year at least, but even longer, and of course, just within the last 12 months or 15 months or so, we have everything from India's reorganization of Kashmir to the controversy over the Citizenship Amendment Act. Just recently, new developments considering the demolition of the Babri Masjid. Abhi, as you wrote at The Diplomat recently, the decision by the Modi government to again crack down on Amnesty International. So all of this, India, and look, India isn't alone in this. This is a global phenomenon. It's a regional phenomenon in South Asia.
Sure.
Democracies around the world are experiencing varying degrees of illiberalism. And of course, I say that from here in New York City, having just witnessed a rather, let's say, difficult debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But anyways, the question I have, really, what I'm hoping to interrogate over the next 20, 30 minutes with you is, is the thesis, and I guess the most prominent, the person that really kicked off this recent round of the discourse is my colleague at the Carnegie Endowment, Ashley Tellis, a longtime hand in the U.S.-India relationship on the American side. And Ashley wrote a recent piece for Carnegie and also republished later at The Print, where he made the case that, India needs to restore its economic momentum and its liberal credentials in order to increase its own clout on the world stage. Is that thesis, in your view, apt, and is India's illiberal slide affecting its foreign relations in an adverse manner?
Again, the whole debate, I think, there are two aspects to this debate and to Tellis's piece. The first part is India's economic clout, or the material base of Indian power, and whether that is growing at a sufficient rate. I suspect, and I'd argue, that it is not. And then there is a second part to this, which is that India's slide into illiberalism, majoritarianism, whatever you want to call it, right? So the issue here is, are these two affecting one another, or are these independent variables? I would suspect that one of the reasons why we are talking so much about India's slide into majoritarianism is because India's material base of power is not growing at a sufficient rate, right? Because imagine a situation where India's economy was growing at 10% per year, right? And India was doing its share. India agreed to, to FONOPs in the South China Sea with the United States, which is something that Harry Harris had once raised, in 2016. So suppose India was doing all of this, India was pulling its own weight in the partnership. Would we still be talking about or raising concerns about India's slide or India's move in a certain direction, right? So that, I think, needs to be kept in mind. So, and I think that's important to put right ahead.
Yeah, so that's, I think you make an interesting point. I mean, my own view on this, and I think things haven't really changed. I mean, a lot of this stuff, I mean, you could really talk about going back to Modi's initial rise to power, or at least rise to the prime minister's office back in 2014, when a lot of what I find is motivating these discussions today is really a mismatch between expectations and reality. Because at least in the United States, India was always, there was a point in the early 2000s when India and China, the United States welcomed the rise of both India and China nominally. Of course, we're today in 2020 when the United States is in great power competition with China and regards India as an important partner. But there was a time at which, both of these rising Asian powers were welcomed. But of course, India was, it was almost an obvious no-brainer to welcome India's rise. I mean, yes, there were bumps in the road, particularly after the nuclear tests in 1998. But the notion that India was this large democracy that maintained a liberal character, it just made it easier for Americans to picture a world in which India was not only a power but a swing power in the American corner, right? And all of this, just to add to this conversation a little bit, I mean, the United States has never been particularly motivated by the domestic character of its partners if there are sufficient national interests at stake in those relationships, right? We can look at plenty of examples through the Cold War, even today, relationships in the Middle East and elsewhere. If they're if partnering with a certain country will suit American national interests, then values are secondary, and I think that's fairly well substantiated. But I think your point about India's material power is well taken. I mean, although where I might differ is that I think that much of this conversation would still be happening. I mean, I guess what's been interesting with for me to observe with the Modi government is you have Modi's first term, which you primarily see a BJP with an agenda that focuses on vikas or development, and falls short on many important measures of that. And then you have this powerful new mandate in 2019, followed by this, successive steps, some, admittedly by the judiciary and not the PMO or the government, that reflect a growing illiberal character. So I think in many ways we would be talking about this internally as well. But, in another point that strikes me as interesting, and Ashley sort of gets to this in his writing on this, is in the United States. I mean, the relationship with India always maintained a very strong bipartisan character, and really it didn't matter if the U.S.-India relationship was being discussed on Capitol Hill with legislators or through the executive branch. India had bipartisan support, and now that is starting to appear less clear, that in many ways the U.S.-India relationship is starting to resemble the U.S.-Israel relationship in many ways, in which you are starting to unfortunately see a much more partisan character, especially in the Trump era. What's your sense of on the Indian side of this equation? I mean, what is your sense of how New Delhi is thinking about the partisan nature of the relationship? I mean, specifically, now that we are in an election year in the United States, is there a concern in India that, given this debate that has now grown about illiberalism and potential stormy waters ahead for the U.S.-India relationship, is there a concern that working with a Democratic president in particular, if Joe Biden were to be elected, would be difficult for India in many ways?
See, what happened is that, I mean, you talk about the view in New Delhi. It depends on who you ask, right? But even within the ruling party and the government. So the official line is this. The official line is it wouldn't matter for U.S.-India ties if Biden occupies the White House in come January, because bipartisan support, blah blah blah. This is the official line, and this is the brave face that the Modi government is putting forward, despite Mr. Modi having effectively endorsed Trump's re-election in the Houston rally last year. So that's the official line. But at the same time, you do see signs that there are concerns, and I'll give you one concrete example. So very recently, the overseas friends of the BJP, which the U.S. chapter of the Overseas Friends of BJP, had registered under FARA as a foreign agent with the Department of Justice. Now, what were they doing, right? So one of the things that they were at one point doing, as a matter of their charter, was trying to correct, and I'm quoting literally from the charter, correct misrepresentations of India in the American press. So there was the sense that in certain quarters, such as the New York Times, the coverage of Mr. Modi was not very favorable, and they had to do something about it. Now, I know that the BJP has formally asked the overseas friends of the BJP US chapter not to campaign under the party's name in the upcoming elections. But the very fact that this something like this was going on in the background tells me that there is a degree of concern, right? And the concerns would be natural in many ways, because yes, the security dimension of the US-India relationship is what drives the thing forward. But at the same time, there are different accents on the other aspects of the relationship, whether that is convergence on climate change or on values, right? And I suspect that if you have a Biden administration, there would be a little pushback on New Delhi. Maybe the pushback would be a little subtle, but there will be a certain pushback, especially if Biden thinks that the United States needs to reclaim its moral authority and assert itself and push back against what it perceives as authoritarianism. So that is there in the background, and I think that remains of some concern. Even though the official line, as I said, is that things are fine, all is well, irrespective of what happens on November 3rd.
Right, and broadly, the story of U.S.-India relations for 20 years now has been a straight line of strategic convergence, deepening cooperation across sectors. Economic issues, security issues, strategic visions of the future of the regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific. And I don't think that that's going to change. Obviously, we haven't really talked about the elephant in the room, or the elephant in the Indo-Pacific, rather, which doesn't have to be India in this case, but is rather China that I'm talking about. And of course, it is interesting to me that this year, much of this debate about illiberalism and the U.S.-India relationship is taking place against the backdrop of the most serious crisis in Sino-Indian relations in several decades. And that, I think, matters because, ultimately, when it comes to the geopolitical calculation in New Delhi and Washington, I think you'll have people that are uncomfortable with the United States lecturing India, and Americans, uncomfortable with India's turn towards illiberalism and authoritarianism. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of this strategic convergence is going to continue because the two countries just have too much to gain from each other, right? That said, we can look at, I think if you look at the history of, or even the present of American alliances around the world, what you do tend to find is that the United States tends to have the closest partnerships and the closest alliances with countries that do tend to be liberal democracies or close to liberal democracies. You look at countries in Western Europe, Japan, South Korea. These are the places where alliances, and here I'm omitting the Trump variable. Ignore everything Trump says about these alliances for a minute. But otherwise, these have tended to be the strongest relationships. And then you have secondary partnerships, straight up, dysfunctional allies like Turkey. And a whole set of partners that do vary. So I think it will matter that India is heading in this direction in terms of the friction that will exist within the U.S.-India relationship. That it won't be as easy as it was before to keep the cart moving up this hill to keep this strategic convergence going. But just because the two countries will continue to have so much in common, that they will, I think, still find a way to work together. It's not going to be, the end of the U.S.-India relationship by any means. And of course, and there's other actors here too. We're talking about regional configurations like the Quad that will also provide additional ballast to this. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you about to say?
No, so it just occurred to me that part of, I've been trying to figure out really why are we seeing, and to just go back to your first question, why are we seeing there's increasing, fairly vocal calls, and not just on the part of Ashley, right? You have other colleagues of ours who have raised questions around what does India's new security order, as Paul Stanland put in a War on the Rocks article. So you see a growing chorus of calls on this illiberalism. I suspect, Ankit, to be perfectly honest with you, I suspect that there is a degree of buyer's remorse when it comes to Mr. Modi, right? Because if you look at some of these people, or in 2014, or some other players and important voices in DC in 2014, they were welcoming Mr. Modi as a potentially as a big reformer, as a visionary who would drive India forward and therefore drive the US-India relationship forward. And now you see that, given that Mr. Modi has not done what needed to have been done on the economic front or on the hard power front, there's certainly this kind of sense of dismay. There's a sense that that things haven't panned out as they imagined. But the odd thing here is that Mr. Modi is delivering on what he promised, right? I mean, look at Kashmir, look at 370. These have been long-standing BJP demands on the electoral manifesto, on the agenda. So he's just he's just delivering what he promised. So there is no subterfuge, there is no sort of underhandedness. So what I want to ask and understand is that why did so many in Washington and also in New Delhi expect that a Hindu nationalist, a proud Hindu nationalist, who comes to power, who's re-elected with a major mandate, suddenly drop his Hindu nationalism and long-standing demands and chug along the economic growth line? So this is frankly something that has been baffling me for a while now.
That's a good question. I mean, my immediate answer, just recalling, I was writing about this quite regularly. I was following the Indian election in 2014, reading the coverage here in the United States and elsewhere. I mean, it really seems, when Modi was being covered, a lot of the international press, I mean, of course, there were references to his difficult history. I mean, at one point he didn't get a U.S. visa. There was obviously all the controversy over 2002 Gujarat. So that was all mentioned in the coverage. But really, I mean, the parts of Modi that people chose to focus on, particularly in the op-ed space, here in the United States, was on this idea of a bold Indian reformer and especially after the election results came in and it became clear that the BJP had a powerful mandate. The idea was that, Modi is a powerful personality. He had gotten things done in Gujarat. Everybody talked about the Gujarat model. And now he would export that to the national level. And there was that language coming from the highest levels of the BJP about, sabka saath, sabka vikas, and a development language. So I think it got people really excited and riled up. And India is, to be fair, I think what every government in India, even the ones that have wanted to carry out structural reform, have learned is that India is, inertia is a powerful force in the Indian bureaucracy in the state, and it is no man, no matter how powerful his force of personality, is going to overcome that overnight. By contrast, however, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, something that I say that's maybe a little unpopular, especially with folks who tend to fret about India's illiberal turn, is that in many ways, Modi and the BJP, they are not the ones changing India. Rather, India is changing, and Modi and the BJP are in many ways a symptom of that change in many ways. I mean, India has a rising aspirational middle class that wants to not only see the country become more powerful, but unfortunately, you are seeing this surge in majoritarian sentiment that, of course, in a country that is 80% Hindu is going to result in fertile political ground for a Hindu nationalist government. So that, I think, is the lesson now in 2019 and going forward that I think has really quickly, there's been a bit of whiplash. I think the turning point for many folks here was actually November 2016 when Modi announced the demonetization move, and it became clear not long after that this was it was certainly bold. I mean, nobody can hold that against Modi that wasn't bold, but it became clear that maybe things weren't going to turn out quite the way people hoped. And of course, I think the September 2016 surgical strikes and certainly Balakot, I think again in the foreign policy realm, spoke to the Indian government's willingness to take bold action, but not necessarily in a way that appeared to be strategically acute, at least to the preference of many in Washington. But I mean, is there let's to kind of think through the worst case scenario here. I mean, I think this new this summer's crisis in Ladakh, which you and I discussed a few podcasts ago. I'd encourage listeners interested in Abhi's views on that to listen to that episode if they missed it. But I think this China episode is really, I think, going to have an important effect in keeping the U.S. and India on track and together. I mean, there have been consultations on this already. India is starting to. I mean, again, I've been doing this long enough to know better, but it looks like India is beginning to at least allow a little bit of the momentum in the Quad to really take effect. And I say this a few days before a ministerial meeting when we'll learn more about the future of that grouping. But I mean, what would it take for all of this to fall apart? I mean, we've talked about friction, we've talked about illiberalism. What would really have to happen for this to go wrong for India and the United States?
No, Ankit, let's talk a little bit about the China part, because I have some. I think
be my guest.
Certain a certain counterintuitive views on this, and one is that yes, there is this potential that this crisis is a turning point for the Quad, for the bilaterals, for trilaterals, everything. But also imagine this, right? India's sort of careful balancing act between China and the United States it's done and dusted for, right? Because you can't play the China card or a closer entente with China to seek concessions or bargains or strategic advantages from the United States anymore, right? Which now means whether New Delhi likes it or not, it has to depend on the United States when the balloon goes up. That gives the United States a very powerful hand, right, in terms of what it can force India to accept, or not really force India to accept, rather, or what it can suggest India or perhaps even lecture India, right? Would a new administration play that hand? Right, because they would say, listen, you can no longer tell us, we also have China and we can partner with China as well. We don't need to depend just on you, right? So that gives that introduces a certain degree of complications. But beyond that, I think I wrote about this, I don't know, earlier this week or last week. What I fail to understand is the following, right? What is at stake for the United States of America in the current crisis? In that, concretely in terms of national interests, in that, let us assume that tomorrow, it just a wild scenario, right? Tomorrow, India says, fine, we'll live with a shifted line of actual control, we fold, right? How does that change anything for the United States of America? You see what I'm saying? So these two things, to my mind, are two things that we have to keep in mind whenever we talk about the future of India-U.S. relations going forward.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, speaking for the Trump administration, at least, I mean, it seems like, the Trump administration hasn't had a particularly difficult time convincing India that China, and particularly Chinese ambitions for, taking a more prominent role in redesigning Asia's security architecture is something to be taken seriously. India, I think, especially after Doklam back in 2017, there has been a significant degree of convergence. I think what the United States really wants out of India, and what it has wanted for a very long time, is a willingness to go further, do things faster, have fewer inhibitions in strategic convergence. And India still isn't quite there yet. And you've been covering recently India's multilateral hedging in many ways, participating in the Russia, India, China trilateral, the SCO, and all these other institutions that India continues to remain committed to. So I think there is a degree of frustration still there. But I think, a Biden administration will, I think, pick things up where the Trump administration is leaving off in many ways with India, I think.
So, by the way, I mean, you mentioned the Russia, India, China trilateral. I just call it a talk shop because that's all that they seem to be doing, and nothing comes out of it. But Russia is something that we should be talking more about whenever we think of India-United States relations, right? Because think about it, right? You have a new Biden administration who generally not be very predisposed to be nice to Mr. Putin, given what they think transpired in 2016 with the election interference and Hillary Clinton, et cetera, right? So under such circumstances, would the Biden administration be willing to look the other way as India goes ahead with receiving the deliveries of the S-400 air defense batteries? I think one regiment is supposed to arrive next year, as far as I can tell. So, or even political consultations with Lavrov and Putin, which we have seen all through this crisis. By the way, Russia has played a fairly vocal, though understated, role in trying to resolve this India-China standoff. So how does the Russia card, get in the way or shape the U.S.-India relations? That's also something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Well, Abhi, I suspect, we'll be back soon enough to talk about new developments in the U.S.-India relationship. I would love to actually have you back in not too long to talk a little bit more about the Quad. I think it'll be interesting to revisit that after this second ministerial meeting that's coming up. So I hope listeners will stay tuned for that. Right. But as always, I want to thank you for coming back on the show. It's very good to have you. And yeah, like I think I told our listeners, I am hoping to have you on more frequently as a regular now that you are at the Diplomat full time. So,
all right. Thank you for having me, Ankit.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.